Hey friends, tonight, let's explore something absolutely logical, using dragons to send letters. Yes, in a world where travel involved mud, more mud, and the occasional robbery by a man with a fork, someone thought, what if we just asked a flying lizard to handle it? Casually bypassing the whole walking for 3 weeks issue. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And do let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a castle courtyard, watching as a scroll is tied delicately, one would hope, to the armored claw of a bronze-scaled creature the size of a large horse. Its wings stretch wide, catching the evening light like sails. A herald bows with perfect form, and the crowd murmurs in reverent awe. Not because the message is urgent, but because this is a dragon. And dragons apparently deliver with style. Of course this is all ceremonial. The dragon is carved wood, painted with ash, and ochre carried on poles by very strong peasants. But for the watching villagers, it's real enough. The notion that your king can send a message across the land on the back of a sky beast, that's political theater worth attending in the mud. In some medieval royal courts, especially during festivals or diplomatic visits, dragons were depicted as messengers of divine will or imperial power. Not just ferocious, but loyal. Not just terrifying, but trusted. That's how the symbolism grew. If the king's message came with the seal of the dragon, it meant something. It meant don't ignore this, or a flaming sky lizard will circle back for a follow-up. The actual message, by the way, was likely boring. Something like, we reaffirm our pact to trade 3 sacks of barley in spring. But it came with a performance, trumpets, smoke, possibly even a guy with bellows hiding behind a curtain, puffing through a dragon-shaped pipe. You walk further into the hall, where the scrolls are kept laid out on wooden racks like freshly baked loaves. The ink smells faintly of oak gall and vinegar. The scribes, hunched like thoughtful question marks, are busy copying royal decrees. You ask one of them just hypothetically whether anyone ever really believed dragons carried letters. He gives a slow nod and says, only the important ones. You see, during the 13th and 14th centuries, dragons were used in manuscript illustrations, not just as fearsome beasts, but sometimes as literal vehicles. Dragons pulling chariots, dragons with scrolls in their claws, dragons perched beside scribes as if editing the margins. Some of these images come from monastic scriptoriums, where frankly, monks may have been low on entertainment, but high on imagination. And in certain imperial courts, like Ming China, or the Holy Roman Empire, dragon symbolism became so tightly woven into statecraft that imaginary dragon logistics weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. If you were lucky enough to receive a scroll with a dragon image coiled around the border, congratulations, you just got state mail. Very elite, possibly haunted. Tonight's curious detail. There are accounts of kings, particularly in Eastern Europe, who had dragon-shaped automata created to roll down banquet tables and deliver messages or gifts. These were wind-up contraptions, complete with snapping jaws and smoke puffs powered by candle heat. Were they efficient? No. But they were dramatic, and that's really what medieval delivery was all about. And now, let's pose a gentle scholarly debate for your dreams to chew on. Did medieval people truly believe dragons could carry letters? Or were these acts more about spectacle legitimacy and reinforcing who held the power to command even myths. Let that float in the air for a bit. Because back in the courtyard, the wooden dragon has taken flight, lifted by ropes, swinging gently as children cheer. It looks just real enough to inspire belief. The scribe waves a small flag. The crowd applauds. And somewhere deep in the royal archives, a clerk logs this theatrical delivery as message received with exceptional flourish. No casualties. Pigeon count 3 scattered, so you return to your quiet chamber, candles low, scroll in hand. You think maybe tomorrow you'll send a message of your own. You don't have a dragon, but you do have a goose that's very territorial and surprisingly fast. Medieval logistics, 1. Prime overnight shipping, 0. And just in case you were wondering, no dragons don't need saddlebags. They are the saddle, the bag, and the threat of late fees all in one. Rest easy tonight, knowing that somewhere in the dusty corners of monastic imagination, your dreams are being delivered by a fire-breathing, scroll-carrying reptile with very strong opinions on postal timeliness. Mythical logistics networks. You're staring at a map now. Not the kind with rivers and roads and sensible borders. No, this one is embroidered onto a faded tapestry, tacked to the stone wall of a noble study that smells like beeswax damp wool and a faint lingering aroma of roasted turnip. The map is stitched with crimson thread and dragon shapes not in the margins, but as the actual lines of travel. Dragon tails curl across mountain ranges. Dragon wings span the coasts. You're pretty sure one dragon is looping directly into France's wine region, which honestly tracks. According to this very official-looking work of fiction, a kingdom's dragon-based delivery system spans across fiefdoms, like a web spun by creatures who clearly don't care about terrain weather or local jurisdiction. Hills, they fly over them. Oceans, they fly above those too. Taxes, they do not apply to dragons. What you're looking at is a mythical logistics network, the medieval version of express shipping. If your parcel could be trusted to a creature with fire breath and an ego the size of a cathedral. So why dragons? Well, think of it this way. Medieval folks had plenty of time to ponder how to make life sound more impressive. When your real courier might take weeks, get robbed, or fall in love and forget the assignment entirely, it was comforting, almost therapeutic, to imagine an alternate system. A fiery winged one. One that delivered without delay or complaint, and definitely didn't demand ale at every tavern stop. Some bestiaries, those beautifully weird medieval animal encyclopedias, placed dragons at the top of the delivery chain. Not for their reliability, mind you, but because of their range. Some entries describe dragons as creatures who slept on mountains but hunted in distant valleys, suggesting they could cover vast distances in a single night. Perfect, then, for message delivery between kingdoms. If you didn't mind your message showing up slightly scorched. There's even a peculiar Latin scroll tucked away in the abbey of St. Heribert, or so legend claims, that outlines the routes of celestial couriers. These weren't angels, though. No wings of white. These were dragons specifically described as operating on holy paths, from monastic outposts to royal courts, gliding through the night sky on the veins of wind ordained by heaven, which sounds less like a shipping route and more like a weather forecast for divine reptiles. Tonight's historical fact is this: in many illuminated manuscripts from the 12th and 13th centuries, dragons weren't only painted as monsters, but as symbols of connection. In one Bohemian codex, a dragon appears linking two cities, its body coiling like a golden road between towers. Scholars debate whether this was purely metaphor or a nod to how myths filled the gaps left by poor infrastructure. Because let's be honest, medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for its highway system. A journey from one province to the next could take days, weeks if it rained, snowed, or someone misplaced a bridge. And dragons didn't need roads. That's part of their charm and their deep logistical appeal. Now comes tonight's delightfully odd detail. There was once a German folk tale involving a dragon courier who delivered love letters for a recluse knight. Each letter was said to arrive sealed with a singe mark, proof it had passed through the breath of the beast. According to the story, one day the dragon refused to deliver a letter because it was too sappy. The knight was devastated. The dragon presumably was unimpressed by poetry. You move your gaze back to the tapestry. Under closer inspection, you notice small symbols next to each dragon flight path. Tiny bells, perhaps, or towers with smoke. Some scholars think these were imagined dragon posts, places where a beast might rest or refuel. Others say it's just fancy embroidery meant to impress guests. Either way, it's clear someone invested serious thread and belief into this fantasy postal service. So here's your academic pillow thought for tonight. Were these mythical courier systems purely entertainment, or were they genuine attempts by medieval minds to reconcile the distance between power and communication? After all, when your king ruled a land, he could barely travel. Imagining dragons bridging that gap wasn't just whimsical. It was a form of control. You step away from the tapestry, letting the candlelight flicker over the golden thread of the longest route, a loop stretching from northern highlands to southern ports. It curls like a sleeping beast, unmoving, yet full of motion. Somewhere in the room, a scribe drops a quill and mutters something about the Milan dispatch still not arriving. You wonder if anyone's considered checking the skies. You smile as you lie down on the straw-filled mattress beside the fire. A moth circles the candle. The coals sigh. And just before you drift off, you think you hear a distant roar above the hills, a sound that might be thunder, or maybe just another express delivery arriving with a bit too much flair. Dragons, after all, never liked subtlety or estimated delivery windows. When monks tracked dragon routes, you're seated in a monastery library, so silent you can hear the scratching of goose feather quills like mice dancing across vellum. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment, melted tallow, and that faintly herbal mustiness that clings to buildings with more candles than windows. A scribe coughs gently. Somewhere a bell tolls once like a polite reminder that time exists, but not urgently. In front of you is a codex. It's thick, bound in cracked leather, and has a faint scorch mark on the edge. The title in Gothic script translates roughly to Observations of the Celestial Beasts of the Northern Quadrant and Their Behaviors Across the Liturgical Year. Translation: it's a monk's attempt at mapping dragon flight paths. Yes, dragons, not stars, not birds. Actual fire-breathing dragons. In a document produced by a perfectly reasonable man, who by all accounts also taught grammar and grew turnips. Here's tonight's historical fact. Medieval monks recorded everything: weather patterns, crop yields, dreams, questionable portents, and yes, even imagined sightings of dragons in the sky. These weren't always treated as fairy tales. In fact, in several monastic records, especially from the 11th to 13th centuries, dragons were cataloged like meteorological events. Strange clouds might be dragons. Lights in the sky, Could be a dragon tail, smoke from a distant mountain, probably a dragon nap gone wrong. One particularly strange entry from a scriptorium in Normandy lists a recurring sky serpent seen during Lent for 3 consecutive years. The monk carefully noted the days, the direction of flight, and even drew little wings beside the margin. He then added in Latin praise, "Be that it flies east, and not toward the wine cellar." You move toward a scroll mounted on the wall, a parchment so thin it crackles as you breathe near it. It's a flight chart, drawn with obsessive precision. Curved lines intersecting like a spider web show alleged routes dragons took when delivering messages between abbeys. Tiny illustrations mark resting spots, cliffs, lakes, or suspiciously convenient towers. Some of these routes were actually based on pilgrim trails or Roman roads, but someone likely bored and highly imaginative redrew them as if dragons had claimed them as sky corridors. One marginalia note even reads, "Avoid flying over Bishop Renault's house. His prayers disturb the wind." There's something sweetly earnest about it. These monks weren't trying to deceive. They were cataloging a world that blurred the line between faith folklore and logistics. And in that blurred space, dragons soared regularly. Tonight's curious oddity: a monk named Alric of Bingen wrote an entire treatise arguing that dragons preferred flying on Thursdays. Why Thursdays? No one knows. But he cited several encounters by shepherds, a few weather anomalies, and one burned tunic as proof. His logic Thursday is the day before fasting Fridays. Dragons, like humans, probably got restless when snacks were limited, and it's not just Western Europe. In certain Armenian monasteries, illuminated manuscripts depict dragons coiling around mountains with dotted lines trailing behind them. Some scholars suggest these represented heavenly currents. Others just say the artist was bored. One image even shows a dragon looking backwards mid-flight, as if double-checking whether the destination abbey left the torch on. Now let's pause for tonight's scholarly question. Were these so-called dragon routes an early form of visual metaphor? Ways of tracking the movement of influence information or fear? Or did some monks genuinely believe dragons delivered messages, carried news, or watched from above with smoky, judging eyes? It's hard to tell. And maybe that's part of the charm, because here you are, now seated in the stone alcove of a forgotten library, watching a novice monk ink yet another sighting into a giant ledger labeled Occurrences and Uncomfortable Phenomena. He writes slowly, but with conviction. You peek over his shoulder. Today's entry, loud wind over cloister roof. Smelled faintly of sulfur. Brother Elias saw a tail. No feathers. Strong wing beat. May have dropped something near the well. You don't ask what was dropped. You're not sure you want to know. The bell tolls again. This time, the sound echoes longer. The scriptorium begins to empty, and you're left alone with the dragon maps. The candlelight makes the ink shimmer faintly, and for a moment, the paths look like veins, living pulsing across the skin of a continent that dreamed while awake. As you lean back, head resting against cold stone, you wonder how many dragons passed above this monastery, real or imagined, and whether those paths, once drawn in ink and belief, still linger somewhere in the sky, waiting for someone to look up at just the right time. Because even if they never existed, they were seen. And sometimes, that's enough to leave a trail. Also, let's be honest, tracking pigeons is boring. But tracking dragons, that's a calling. Castles with landing platforms? You're pacing the upper wall of a castle, the kind that feels more like a wind tunnel than a home. The breeze nips at your cloak, The flagstones wobble just enough to be unsettling, and your guide, an aging steward who smells of ink and onions, gestures toward a large flat section of the roof. He says proudly, "This is the dragon landing." You pause. You look at the stone. You look at him. You wait for the punchline. None comes. Tonight, we're venturing into the strange architectural feature found in several medieval blueprints and marginal notes, the so-called dragon platforms. Allegedly designed for the arrival of airborne beasts. Or, more practically, just really big balconies that someone insisted were for dragons. The idea isn't totally random. Medieval architects occasionally built elevated flat spaces on towers and keeps for a number of reasons observatories watch posts, and sometimes just fancy terraces for nobles to stand on and wave dramatically into the fog. But somewhere along the way, stories started to circulate that these areas were meant for dragons. As in, if dragons were real, this is where they would land. Right next to the guest suite. How thoughtful. Your steward continues the tour, pointing out scratch marks on the stone. From the claws, he says, you lean closer. They do look suspiciously like they were made last week, possibly with a fork. Still, some chroniclers took the idea seriously. There's an account from the 14th century French town of Montpensier describing a dragon rest atop the Viscount's tower, where it slept 3 nights and ate 1 goat. Real? Probably not. Symbolic? Definitely. The goat, for one, appears in no other records, which is suspicious. Goats don't just disappear without someone noticing, especially in France. But the idea stuck. Some castles, especially those built or renovated during peak dragon folklore periods, had reinforced roof platforms or extended stone outcroppings. And while the official purpose was usually defensive or ceremonial, local legends often gave them more exciting purposes: sky docks, perches for winged couriers, viewing platforms for the nobility to admire their imaginary air force. Tonight's historical fact: in at least 3 known illuminated manuscripts from the late 1200s, there are drawings of dragons curled up on castle roofs like sleepy cats. Some are peacefully coiled. Others are mid-landing, with wings extended, almost all of them parked on platforms adorned with heraldry, or what looks suspiciously like velvet. And that velvet, that's our curious detail of the night. A German folk tale suggests that the softest cloth should be laid out for any visiting dragon. Not for comfort. Dragons allegedly didn't care for texture, but to avoid scratch marks on royal stonework. Yes, apparently, even mythical reptiles were expected to respect interior design. Of course, there's debate among scholars. Some argue that these landing platforms were metaphorical, representing openness to divine or magical insight, not actual beast landings. Others say they were symbolic of elevated power. And then there's the theory that a few eccentric lords simply leaned into dragon lore as a branding tactic. Come visit Castle Hearthfell, home of the last known dragon landing great for tourism. Not so great for insurance premiums. You now find yourself staring at an architectural plan in a dusty codex. The notes written in calligraphy that gets shakier toward the bottom outline dragon-safe masonry and recommend angled ridges to ease the descent of winged beasts. There's even a side note: no need for chains. Only the uninvited must be bound. You're not sure if that's a construction tip or relationship advice. Outside, the wind howls around the parapets. A raven perches near the edge, unbothered by your presence. You half expect it to nod sagely and confirm, yes, this is where the dragons came. But it just stares and sneezes. So here's your dreamy debate for the night. Did medieval builders genuinely believe dragons might visit, or did they simply carve their hopes into stone like any good storyteller would? After all, a platform doesn't need a real visitor to become a landing site. Sometimes, all it needs is belief repetition and a conveniently missing goat. Back in the guest chamber, the fire crackles and casts shadows that dance like wings on the far wall. The steward has left you a wool blanket and a ceramic cup of something warm and questionably spiced. You pull it close, nestle into the hay-stuffed cushions, and let your mind wander upward through smoke-past battlements into the night air, where dragons were once expected. And you know what? If you were a dragon, you'd probably land here too. Fireproof mailbags and other problems. You're in a chamber that smells like scorched leather, boiled wax, and something suspiciously like regret. A table before you holds a variety of pouches, some made of canvas, others of metal mesh, one that's definitely just a repurposed soup ladle with a lid. A monk in singed robes picks one up with a pair of tongs and mutters, "This one lasted almost a full mile." Welcome to the medieval world's attempt at solving a very specific, very fictional problem. How do you keep a letter from catching fire when it's strapped to a dragon? Tonight's historical fact is only half ridiculous. While dragons weren't real sorry dreamers, the logistics of delivering messages across dangerous conditions were, and people did worry about things like water damage, smoke highwaymen, and yes, heat. So naturally, it wasn't a huge leap for the medieval imagination to begin wondering what would happen if your courier breathed fire. You pick up a mailbag prototype, lined with a mix of clay goat hide and what looks like some sort of alchemical paste. It's heavy, stiff, and smells like an argument between a cheese wheel and a candle. According to a marginal note in a treatise on aerial beasts, this design was meant to resist both inner flame and outer ambition. Poetic? Useless, but poetic. In some of the more imaginative scriptoriums, monks debated materials that could hypothetically survive dragon transport. Asbestos was unknown in Europe until later centuries, but some scholars experimented with soaked parchment, bark paper, soaked in vinegar, and even thin plates of lead, etched with messages. Yes, lead mail. Excellent for resisting fire, horrible for weight, great for making sure your dragon develops back problems. Tonight's bizarre historical tidbit. One manuscript from the Abbey of Blackmore describes a fireproof letter sealed in a lump of clay. The idea was that the dragon would carry the hard ball in its claws, then drop it into a courtyard from a height. Once retrieved, the recipient would chip it open, and if lucky, find a still readable scroll inside. If unlucky, they'd find molten wax and a message that simply said, "Try again." Now, you glance at the tools around the workshop. There's a long iron hook labeled retrieval stick, a pair of dragon mitten prototypes, and a saddle with what appears to be a scroll compartment, lined with fish scales. Not actual dragon hide, of course, just the next best thing, according to someone who clearly never met a dragon, but had many opinions about salmon. And the parchments themselves weren't left out. Some letters were rumored to be inked using skyproof ink, a mixture of lamp-black honey and rosewater that wouldn't run, scorch, or fade when exposed to heat. In truth, it probably just made the dragons hungry. And sticky. Your guide, a beardless alchemist with more enthusiasm than eyebrows, explains that some messages were written in duplicates, one for the intended reader, and one to be sacrificed to the flames as a backup warning. You ask if this ever worked. He shrugs and says, The important part was that people believed it might, which leads us to tonight's cozy conundrum. Did medieval writers actually try to solve fantasy problems just to make the myth feel real? Or was the entire exercise a kind of scholarly play, where dragons stood in for divine chaos, and every letter that survived a journey was proof of divine favor or good weather? You lean back against a beam and notice a tapestry on the wall. It shows a regal dragon in mid-flight, carrying a velvet pouch with a tiny crown embroidered on it. Below, a knight reaches up with gloved hands, as if catching a very complicated package. In the corner of the image, a servant holds a tray with water bandages and what looks suspiciously like a fire extinguisher made from a pig bladder. Of course it is. As you prepare to leave the workshop, your guide hands you a wrapped bundle. Inside, a small roll of parchment sealed in beeswax and tied with a silver thread. You ask what it says. He winks and replies, "Depends on how hot your dreams get tonight." You retreat to your chambers, where the fire burns low and the shadows flicker like wings on the wall. You place the parchment on the sill and imagine a dragon waiting outside, claws curled neatly around the windowsill. Breath warm, but restrained eyes, politely inquisitive. Because even in a world without dragons, someone had to imagine the logistics. Someone had to ask the very important question: how do we send mail when our courier is a walking flamethrower? And if nothing else, they invented the first medieval version of flame-retardant packaging. Take that parchment-eating candle. Guilds for the taming of sky beasts. You find yourself in a stone hall that hums with the sort of energy only bureaucracy can create. Long benches, carved with sigils of wings and talons, line the walls. There's a mural of a dragon shaking hands, well claws, with a man in a robe. And above the great oak door is a phrase painted in dramatic Latin script: Domare caelum est servire regnum. To tame the sky is to serve the realm. Welcome to the Guild of Dragon Masters, or at least the idea of it. You're not sure if this guild ever actually existed, but someone definitely acted like it did. And that's almost the same thing in medieval Europe. In several 13th and 14th century manuscripts, especially the ones that blur the line between bestiary and fantasy novel, you'll find references to sky orders, brotherhoods of the Talon, or the Winged Keepers. These weren't just dragon fan clubs. They were described in incredible detail as organizations responsible for training, handling, and licensing dragons as state messengers, guardians, or very occasionally ceremonial chauffeurs for nobles with very high self-esteem. One scroll from the archives of the Rhineland mentions an order of the Crimson Scale, complete with initiation rites involving fire feathers and a suspiciously long silence test. Apparently, one had to stand in total quiet for 3 days in a cave to earn the beast's trust, or just to hear less arguing. Tonight's historical fact: medieval guilds were real widespread and often highly structured. There were guilds for coopers, for shoemakers, for painters, even for rat catchers. So the idea of a guild for sky beast handlers wasn't completely outlandish. What was outlandish was their supposed training manual, which recommended whispering in Old Norse, singing lullabies during full moons, and never making eye contact on Thursdays. You step toward a wooden table covered in records. Some of them are training logs, written in shaky ink, with notes like "subject ignited tail, twice progressing." Another reads, "Wing stretch complete. Handler mildly crisped. Encouraging." There's even a chart mapping the hierarchy within the guild. Grand Scaled Warden, Supreme Trainer, possibly part dragon. Sky writes, builders of saddles armor and scroll harnesses, flame speakers, diplomats trained to negotiate with fire-breathing beasts, read shout with authority, ash apprentices, newbies, frequently scorched, permanently nervous. And here comes tonight's charmingly weird detail. One legend from northern Italy describes a traveling examiner who visited castles to test dragon handling claims. His method? He'd drop a smoked herring from the ramparts and watch for aerial reaction. If a dragon appeared, he'd stamp the guild parchment. If not, the noble would be fined for wasting royal sky resources. There's no proof this man existed, but someone drew him herring and all. You look up at the painting near the hearth. It shows a young squire presenting a scroll to a dragon perched beside a keep. The beast is wearing what appears to be a ceremonial collar made of gold, yes, but also bells. You squint. No, not bells. Tiny scroll cases. It's a delivery dragon. Jingly, but efficient. This leads us to tonight's gentle academic pondering. Were these guilds imagined to add legitimacy to fantastical tales? Or did they reflect a genuine desire to organize the myth, to turn chaos into career paths, even if only on parchment? Because nothing says control like putting a dragon in a ledger. You stroll outside now, where the training yard supposedly hosted exercises. There are scorch marks on the flagstones, possibly from cooking, possibly from storytelling. A series of targets still hang on the far wall. One is charred. Another has been replaced by a painting of a chicken labeled test subject. You hear a whistle, long, melodic, and slightly off-key. A gust of wind follows lifting dust and a few feathers into the air. You look up, but of course the sky is empty. Still, you can't shake the feeling that something knows you were watching. Back in your quarters, you curl beneath wool blankets, your mind replaying the hierarchy, the scrolls, the absurdly named titles. Grand Scaled Warden. You'd put that on a business card, or at least a tavern tab, because deep down, even the most grounded minds wanted dragons to be real. But more importantly, they wanted dragons to be manageable, preferably with uniforms dues and a nice end-of-year banquet. That, after all, is the most medieval thing of all, not just believing in magic, but organizing it. Why? The nobility trusted dragons over humans. You're seated at a long, over-polished banquet table beneath a chandelier made of antlers and poorly distributed ambition. Around you, nobles recline on high-backed chairs that creak with both age and inherited arrogance. A fire blazes behind you, roasting something that once had too many legs, and beside the carved centerpiece of a griffin, jousting a boar, there rests a scroll. But this scroll hasn't been handed to a squire, or a page, or even a very responsible chicken, which surprisingly was sometimes done. No, this scroll, according to the assembled lords and ladies, was delivered by a dragon. A large, loyal, and absolutely incorruptible dragon. Because if there's one thing medieval nobility hated more than muddy roads and rebellious peasants, it was unreliable messengers. Tonight's historical fact: nobles, especially those operating at great distances from royal centers, had enormous trust issues when it came to information. Messages could be delayed, altered, stolen, or misused. Human couriers might be bribed. They might gossip. They might read the message and accidentally deliver it to the wrong side. It happened. Often. And so in literature and court culture, the dragon became a stand-in for perfect loyalty. A dragon couldn't be bribed with coins or seduced by wine. A dragon didn't forget instructions because they saw a cute goat. A dragon didn't spill secrets at the tavern. It just flew alone, powerful, and terrifyingly committed to its route. In royal romances and political fables, dragons appear as ultimate loyalists. They serve the king without question. They deliver only the truth. In some texts, a dragon returning with a torn scroll meant the message had been intercepted but not compromised. Because no one in their right mind tries to mug a dragon. And here comes tonight's curious detail. A 14th century English poem, The Lay of the Embered Wing, describes a duke who, betrayed by spies, sends his final will and testament via a scorched herald. The beast is depicted carrying a banner of truth with a seal that cannot be broken because it's tattooed onto the dragon's wing. Quite the visual. Also terrible for the dragon. But this is allegory, not veterinary care. You take a sip of something warm and questionably meaty, while one of the guests, a countess with a silver circlet and strong opinions, leans in and whispers, "People lie. Dragons burn liars." And that, it seems, was the thinking. You look around the hall. Everywhere tapestries show dragons not just as monsters, but as protectors. One is guarding a gate. Another is bowing before a crowned figure. A third appears to be dictating terms to a bishop. Interpret as you will. Of course, this belief wasn't universal. Not everyone was eager to imagine fire-breathing beasts in charge of their sensitive correspondence. But among nobles, especially those obsessed with honor bloodlines and secrets, a magical courier that couldn't be tempted was strangely comforting. Some scholars suggest the idea of dragon messengers emerged as a reaction to the failures of human loyalty. When alliances crumbled and couriers turned coat, it made sense to imagine a creature too terrifying to betray. And thus the dragon became a symbol not of chaos, but of purity of purpose. Which leads us to tonight's scholarly whisper. Did the image of loyal message-bearing dragons arise, not from belief in magic, but from disappointment in humanity? You step away from the warmth of the hall, now out into the crisp courtyard air. Torches flicker along the walls, and above, stars glint like ancient watchful eyes. A servant leads you past the stables, horses, yes, but also a large empty stone enclosure. Too big for livestock. Too strange to explain. The sign beside it, reserved royal courier. Of course it is. Inside your chambers, the fire is low. A velvet pouch has been left on your pillow. Inside, a tiny wooden dragon carved in profile, its wings curled, and a scroll tied around its neck with golden thread. A gift, perhaps, or a message. You hold it up to the firelight and wonder, was it safer to trust a mythical beast than a breathing, blinking courtier? Would you rather entrust your words to claws and flame, or to someone who smiles too much at the wine table? Sleep comes slowly, your thoughts circling like wings in the mist. But one thing's clear. Dragons don't gossip, and in some castles, that made them more welcome than cousins. Dragons as postal warnings. You're standing at the edge of a wide, echoing courtyard that smells faintly of horses' burned herbs and a decision someone's definitely going to regret. A trumpet sounds brief, sharp, ceremonial. And from above the outer gate, a watchman yells, "Incoming correspondence." With teeth, the guards stiffen. Torches are extinguished. The mood shifts. Because in this part of the realm, if a message is delivered by dragon, it doesn't mean urgent. It means ominous. Tonight's history-tinged tale winds us into a darker corner of medieval imagination where dragons weren't simply couriers, but warnings, not cute paper boys with scales, more like flaming airborne ultimatums. If you saw wings overhead, you didn't open your arms. You prepared your moat. You see, in many stories, a dragon carrying a scroll wasn't there to chat. It was there to threaten. The scroll might say, "Declare loyalty," or "Withdraw your troops," or "Your taxes are due, peasant baron." But the real message wasn't the words. It was the delivery method, because the unspoken part of any dragon mail was this: "This letter flies, and so can we. Choose wisely." Tonight's historical fact. In numerous medieval epics and allegorical tales, especially those from Eastern Europe and the Byzantine fringe dragons, often played a symbolic role in diplomacy. When rulers sent emissaries in the form of fire-born messengers, it was shorthand for "This request comes with teeth." A few scrolls even describe them as embers wrapped in courtesy. One such account comes from a 13th century Polish chronicle, where a warlord sends a messenger with a dragon crest sewn into his tunic. The man says nothing, just hands over a letter sealed with wax-bearing claw marks and ashes. Within days, the recipient castle lowers its banners and offers tribute. Did the dragon exist? No. But the idea landed just fine. You move toward a stone alcove where one of these warning scrolls is supposedly preserved, singed around the edges, wrapped in charred silk. A note below it reads, "Recovered after compliance." Someone added in pencil centuries later, "No follow-up needed." And now, for tonight's delightfully strange detail. A French legend tells of a noble family who developed a scale-tone cipher, a way of folding messages in triangular shapes to resemble dragon scales. These were placed on rooftops before negotiations. If the message was accepted, the recipient would burn one and display the smoke. If rejected, the dragon would visit in person, or so they claimed. Either way, the stakes were smoky. Back in the Great Hall, a nobleman gestures toward a tapestry that shows a dragon descending on a village with a scroll tied to its tail. Flames flicker behind it, and peasants appear to be reading the letter very quickly, probably skimming, definitely sweating. You wonder how many of these stories were metaphors. Were dragons just fear-given wings? Or were they narrative stand-ins for the looming power of an army, a king, or a distant sovereign whose messengers always cast a long shadow? Tonight's cozy academic riddle is this: did the concept of dragon post arise as a tool of soft power, a theatrical way to say you're on notice? Or was it just the product of lords with flair who believed even a threat should be stylish? Because let's face it, sending a threatening note by foot is petty. Sending it via flaming sky lizard, that's flair with follow-through. You leave the hall and stroll past a row of extinguished torch sconces. The night is cool, the stars dimmed by thin clouds. You pause under a balcony where carved stone dragons leer down at the yard. One of them holds a scroll in its claws. You're almost sure it wasn't holding that an hour ago. You reach your chamber. On your pillow sits a folded letter, unsealed, no fire damage. The ink is neat, the message polite. "We request your presence at sunrise. Please do not make us send the other kind of message." You nod. You will be attending. As you drift into sleep, you picture a scroll slicing through the clouds, carried not by feather or hoof, but by wing, by claw, by the quiet understanding that some letters do not wait, and some messengers don't knock. Flame-stamped seals and charred edges, you're hunched over a writing desk made of oak so ancient it probably remembers the invention of ink. Candles sputter in iron holders, casting jumpy shadows across parchment stacked like awkward pancakes. But it's not the message you're focused on, it's the seal. And more specifically, how to make it look like a dragon had something to do with it. Because in tonight's tale, we delve into a rather niche obsession of medieval correspondence scrolls that arrived slightly singed, sealed with fire, and faintly smelling of something that may or may not be mythical. That's right, flame-stamped seals, messages with crispy corners, letters that came pre-toasted. You see, when your message was supposedly delivered by dragon people, expected a little drama. A bit of burn, maybe a whisper of smoke trailing from the scroll like it had just done battle with a torch and won. Tonight's historical fact: sealing letters with wax was a serious business in the Middle Ages. The seal served as both security and status. But while most used stamps carved from metal or wood, impressed with family crests or church symbols, some lords and scribes got creative, especially when the message was delivered by fictional fire-breathing courier. One illuminated scroll from the Burgundian court contains a margin note that reads, "Apply flame, gently not to destroy, only to suggest." Below it, a test seal appears, a red wax circle with its edges blistered as if licked by flame. The image stamped within a dragon's eye, surrounded by swirling smoke patterns. It's absolutely over the top. It's also completely on brand for the 14th century. You dip your fingers in a pot of ash nearby a common trick to dust the edges of letters so they appear freshly roasted. Some messages were even stored in warmed clay tubes just long enough to warp the parchment slightly. The result, a scroll that looked like it had traveled through fire and returned triumphant. Never mind the fact it probably just sat next to a bread oven. And now, for tonight's odd historical delight. In a northern Italian abbey, a set of love letters was discovered hidden in a wall. Each one was sealed with a dragon motif and kissed with blackened corners. But they weren't warnings. They were flirtations. One read, "If my words arrive, warm no, it is not from fire, but from the heart that dared to write it." You pause, a romantic who sealed their letters like dragon attacks. Now that's commitment. You look over at a tattered instruction manual, part bestiary, part postal guide, offering suggestions for adding authenticity to one's scrolls. Some highlights include: hold over a flame just until it crinkles. Use red ink that bleeds slightly into parchment for the fire-marked effect. Singe one edge diagonally, never horizontally. Dragons do not fly sideways. This leads to tonight's scholarly musing. Were these fiery finishes acts of creative communication or subtle plays for prestige? Did scorched edges say, "This message survived danger," or simply, "Look how important I am"? Even my correspondence smolders with myth. You step out into the hallway now, where a servant is carrying a bundle of letters on a tray. You glance over them, wax seals in crimson, emerald, and gold, each one pristine, except for one. That one's charred, just at the tip. Its parchment curled as if it passed too close to a fireplace or something alive and irritable. The servant notices your stare and says matter-of-factly, "That one's from Lord Darren." He likes to imply things. Of course he does, because implication was everything. A letter didn't need to come from a dragon. It just needed to look like it might have. That hint of danger, that whisper of magic enough to make the recipient hesitate before breaking the seal. Enough to make them wonder, did this arrive by hand or by wing? As you return to your chamber, you find a scroll waiting on the sill. The seal is unbroken, but warm, genuinely warm. You touch the edge just lightly singed. No message on the outside, just a symbol, a dragon mid-flight scroll in claw. You smile. You don't open it. Not yet, because some messages are meant to smolder for a while. And in a world of cold ink and cautious parchment, a little fire goes a long way. Rural villagers and the sky tax. You're trudging through a muddy village road where ducks outnumber shoes, and the air smells like hay-wet wool and a vague sense of superstition. The sky is overcast, the kind of gray that makes people blame everything on dragons. Bad harvest dragon, lost sheep dragon, wife's stew burned. Definitely dragon, and above it all, looming like a second rent collector, is the newest medieval inconvenience, the sky tax. No, you're not mishearing it. Welcome to the tale of how rural villagers, already elbow-deep in chores and mysterious foot rashes, became convinced that they owed tribute to invisible flying fire-prone couriers. Tonight's historical fact isn't quite listed in official ledgers, but it lives in folklore, local complaints, and the occasional marginal doodle of a farmer flipping off a winged silhouette. As the myths of dragon couriers spread, some rural regions developed the belief that dragons flying overhead, especially on royal business, required a toll. Not a formal tax, mind you, but a kind of spontaneous tribute. Bread left on windowsills, eggs stacked at crossroads, one suspiciously well-fed goat tied to a post and forgotten near a clearing. You pass a weather-beaten sign outside a cottage that reads, "Leave offering. No flames, please." A villager smudged with flour and judgment nods at you as she leaves a crust of bread atop a tree stump. "It's for the sky beasts," she says. You never know when one's carrying news. This is where practicality and panic meet. People believed that if you didn't acknowledge the presence of a message-bearing dragon, if you didn't respect the mail in the air, you might accidentally intercept it, which was very bad luck. Not to mention possibly illegal under sky law, an entirely imaginary but very convincing concept whispered in markets and over barrels of pickled something. One tale from a 15th century English hamlet tells of a man who mocked the sky tax. He refused to leave a gift despite a dragon-shaped cloud passing overhead. Within the week, his chimney collapsed, his pigs ran away, and his soup turned to frogs. Coincidence? Probably. But his neighbors didn't think so. They rebuilt the offering stump that afternoon. Tonight's quirky historical curiosity. In parts of Bohemia, villagers tied letters to scarecrows, hoping to send them via passing dragons. Some even painted eyes on their roofs to show awareness of the sky. One cottage was decorated with large red dots and the words, "We see you, friend," written in pine tar. A kind of medieval air traffic courtesy. The concept of sky tax wasn't always about fear. Sometimes it was status. If a dragon flew low over your farm, it meant your land lay along a noble air route implied importance. Kind of like medieval zoning. Some families even bragged about how often their haystacks had been blessed with wing shadow. You step into the local tavern, where a chalkboard lists prices. Ale, jeden groat, stew, 2 groats, seat facing east, good dragon viewing, 1 extra groat. You take that seat, obviously. At the table beside you, an old man is recounting the time a scroll fell from the sky and landed in his barley. He tried to read it, but claims it caught fire in his hands. He now wears gloves all year round, just in case it happens again. Scholars who study rural superstitions tend to raise their eyebrows at all this. There's no evidence that any real government imposed a dragon-based tax, but that's not the point. The belief itself functioned like social glue. It gave structure to the chaos of unpredictable news, royal decisions, and weather that changed its mind more often than the bishop's cook. Which brings us to tonight's gentle debate. Was the sky tax belief a response to actual fear or a form of ritual respect? Did peasants truly think dragons demanded eggs and stale scones? Or was it their way of showing deference to things they couldn't control, like king's clouds and occasionally combusting birds? You step back outside, watching as smoke curls from chimneys like messages of their own. A child ties a ribbon to a stick and waves it at the sky. Her grandmother gently places a boiled potato beside it and murmurs, "Just in case." The clouds shift. For a moment, one looks vaguely scaled. You walk on, and as the evening sets in, you pass another offering, this one, a half-eaten turnip, and a note that reads, "To whom it may concern, good luck with the delivery," because even in places with no roads, no dragons, and no stamps, some messages still get sent, and some taxes are just part of the story. Heraldry with wings and teeth. You're walking through a grand hallway, lined with banners, red, blue, gold, and an alarming shade of "I spilled wine on this once," but called it a design choice. Every few feet, a different coat of arms stares down at you. Lions, boars, eagles. And then suddenly something more dramatic. A dragon, mouth open, wings outstretched, scroll clenched in its teeth like it's about to make a very intense delivery. Welcome to the flamboyant world of medieval heraldry, where symbols didn't just say who you were, they screamed it with teeth and talons. Tonight's historical fact: dragons appeared frequently in coats of arms across medieval Europe, not just as scary decorations, but as full-blown identity statements. And in some families, especially those involved in royal courier duties, diplomacy, or the administration of vast lands, dragons were used to signal speed protection. And, well, that you didn't trust horses with anything important. One of the oldest examples comes from the 13th century in Wales, unsurprisingly, the birthplace of Wydreig Goch, the red dragon that still graces the national flag. Their dragons weren't just fearsome, they were messengers of sovereignty. Powerful, swift, and loyal to the land, you pause in front of one particularly worn banner. The dragon on it is gold, two-headed, and clutching a parchment in each claw. Above it, the family motto, Ut Draconis, Fidelis, Volatis, as faithful as the dragon's flight. The irony: most dragons in literature were notoriously unreliable. But on a banner, they were your winged, fireproof LinkedIn profile. Some noble houses took it even further. A 14th century Burgundian knight, known as Sir Tiberon the Swift, claimed descent from a sky beast of diplomacy, and had his armor engraved with a tiny dragon delivering a scroll mid-air. His seal bore the inscription, "I arrive before the lies do." Poetic, possibly slanderous, definitely memorable. Tonight's curious detail. A manual on heraldic design from the 15th century includes a section on beasts suitable for scroll bearing. It lists falcons, stags awkward, and of course dragons marked as most noble best for urgent dispatch, but may singe edges. There's even an illustration of a dragon politely bowing while presenting a letter on a silver platter. Because manners, you notice a mural at the end of the hall. It shows a dramatic scene. A besieged castle flames in the distance, and above it all, a dragon swooping in, not to attack, but to deliver a message. The defenders cheer, One holds the open scroll aloft. It reads simply, "Help is coming." The dragon looks proud. Was this propaganda? Probably. But like all good heraldry, it didn't have to be true. It just had to feel true. Scholars have long debated whether these heraldic dragons were based on real beliefs in sky couriers, or if they were simply convenient metaphors. Some argue they reflected the desire for incorruptible delivery in a time when information was slow stolen or suspicious. Others say the dragon was just a flashy flex, because why settle for a dove when you can have a flaming air serpent? And here's tonight's gentle scholarly puzzle. Did nobles adopt dragon courier imagery to imply divine favor and control? Or was it more of a medieval branding strategy, a way of saying, "Trust me, I have connections"? In the sky, outside banners flap in the wind. You glance up at one more coat of arms, this one featuring a very tired-looking dragon curled around a stack of books. The motto beneath reads, "Neither rain, nor snow, nor hostile bishop. Respect." As you make your way down the stone steps and back toward the guest chambers, the wind carries a faint snapping of cloth banners moving like wings. You can almost hear the rustle of a scroll unrolling in midair. Almost. Inside your bed awaits tucked in beside a fire-lit alcove where a shield leans against the wall. On it, a small painted dragon holding a letter in its tail. Because even if the dragons weren't real, the messages always were. And sometimes it takes a creature with wings and teeth to make sure the truth arrives on time. Dragon whistles and summoning horns. You're standing at the edge of a misty hill, holding what looks like a slightly melted recorder and hoping it doesn't explode. Beside you is a horn twisted carved and large enough to summon either a beast or a particularly dramatic goat. Someone behind you says confidently, "Blow it once for arrival, twice for pickup, thrice if you've changed your mind and want to apologize in advance." Welcome to the curious chapter of dragon summoning tools, the musical instruments for creatures that may or may not have existed, but definitely had a flair for punctuality. Tonight's historical fact. Across folklore and a few suspiciously poetic chronicles, there are repeated mentions of instruments used to call dragons. From bone flutes, to silver horns, to bells made of brass, and mystery medieval storytellers often imagined that dragons could be summoned like extremely dangerous carrier pigeons, with excellent hearing. You raise the dragon whistle to your lips. It smells like cedar ash and someone's bad idea. The wind picks up. Nothing answers. Probably for the best. In one 14th century bestiary, a monk details the construction of a sky courier lure made from the horn of a bull and the feather of a swan. It was said to mimic the high-pitched whistle of a mountain wind, something dragons apparently enjoyed, like the medieval version of a favorite podcast. The manuscript includes a drawing of the device and a caption that reads, "Do not use near poultry." Helpful. Some nobles took the idea very seriously. The Earl of Corvenport allegedly commissioned a blacksmith to forge a summoning bell fit for winged royalty. It had 7 tones each representing a different message category. One for peace, one for war, one for urgent but vague. No one knows if it worked, but the bell now resides in a cathedral tower where it is strictly used to signal soup time. Tonight's curious detail, a 15th century folk song from Saxony titled "The Horn of the High Hill," tells the story of a lonely scribe who climbed a cliff every full moon and blew a silver trumpet. One day, the sky split open, and a dragon came not to eat him, but to deliver a letter. Addressed to the keeper of lost pages, it simply said, "Your dedication has been noted." Back in our more practical realm, you find a locked chest in the corner of a dusty armory. Inside, a collection of flutes, pipes, and conical horns, some engraved with scales, others with runes. Each is labeled with an intended dragon personality: cooperative, indifferent, possibly moody. You try one, it makes a sound best described as a very determined sneeze. Still, you wonder, was the point ever really to call a dragon? Or was it a ritual, an act of hopeful ceremony, a way of saying, "I've done my part. If a sky beast wants to help, I'm ready. If not, at least the villagers are impressed." Some scholars say these instruments were metaphors representing readiness, communication, or just the universal medieval urge to blow things loudly in hopes they'd respond. Others point out that summoning songs may have once been coded signals for human messengers. A low note for safe passage, a high trill for send help, things are on fire. Which brings us to tonight's dreamy debate. Did people believe dragons answered horns and whistles? Or did the music simply give shape to hope, an invitation to something bigger? Winged and impossibly punctual, outside the hall the sky is dark. You take the smallest of the whistles and step onto the battlement. It glows faintly in the moonlight. You raise it, breathe in, blow. The note is soft, sharp, and swallowed instantly by the wind. Nothing happens, except a hush falls across the nearby trees. A few birds lift into the air. A torch flickers in confusion. And in the distance, far, far up, you think you hear something move. You pocket the whistle. Inside, by the hearth, someone's left a parchment on your chair. It's unsigned, unsealed. The edges are warm. At the top, scrawled in a looping script, it reads, "Nice try. We hear you." You smile, because maybe it was never about whether dragons would come. Maybe it was about sending the signal anyway. And sometimes the sky whispers back. Accidental deliveries to the wrong keep. You're staring at a scroll. It's elegant. It's sealed with red wax in the shape of a dragon claw. And it's addressed to His Grace, the Lord of Wormwatch Keep. There's just one problem. You're not the Lord of Wormwatch Keep. You're at Greystone Hold, which means someone or some winged courier just made a very medieval delivery blunder. Tonight's story glides gently into the chaotic world of accidental dragon deliveries, or what might be history's most flamboyant form of miscommunication. You know, back when a simple "oops, wrong castle" could mean war marriage, or an awkward trade agreement involving 17 goats and a confused bishop. Tonight's historical fact. While dragons weren't actually zipping between castles with letters in their claws, tragically misdelivered messages were absolutely a thing. And in a society where information moved slower than soup, cooled a wrongly delivered note could change everything. Marriages were arranged by mistake. Sieges were launched prematurely. One 14th century report even blamed a lost courier for triggering a regional cheese embargo. Yes, cheese. Now imagine layering a dragon on top of that. If you were lucky, the mistake was caught early. If you were unlucky, you opened a scroll meant for your enemy, your cousin, or a woman named Isadora, who definitely wasn't expecting a letter from you. Some tales go further. One folk tale from Brittany tells of a dragon trained to deliver love poems between two noble houses. All was well until the dragon confused Wolfram of Delmere with Wilhelm of Delmount. One got a poem. The other got a marriage proposal. Both accepted. Nobody told the dragon. Tonight's curious detail. An illuminated margin sketch in a bohemian legal text shows a dragon sheepishly returning a scroll, its claws held up like a child who knows they messed up. Behind it, two nobles argue in front of their respective castles, both shouting, "We didn't order this." Some pseudo-legal texts even included dragon-related delivery clauses. Jokes probably, but written with absolute gravity. One stated, "Should correspondence of sensitive nature arrive by beast of flame to the wrong hall, the receiving party must not read, open interpret copy, or dramatically react without written consent from the intended keep," which is hilarious, considering most castles didn't even lock their doors properly. You take another look at the scroll. It's sealed but slightly scorched at the corners. Someone was showing off. You hold it up to the light. You could return it, or you could open it and see if it's a love letter, a death threat, or a really aggressive dinner invitation. Behind you, a steward clears his throat. He suggests sending it back via hawk. You shake your head. That would be insulting. No. This demands equal majesty. If a dragon brought it, a dragon should return it. Or at least something with wings and attitude. Perhaps a heavily perfumed pigeon. This brings us to tonight's academic feather ruffler. Did stories of dragon mail gone wrong reflect genuine anxiety about the fragility of communication? Or were they gentle parables about trust consequence and knowing where your messages actually end up? In a world where even parchment traveled with pomp, the idea that the most majestic courier could still botch the job added a lovely little pinch of humility. Even fire breathers make mistakes, and honestly, that made the myth more relatable. You walk to the tower balcony. The wind is high, the clouds low. You tie the scroll to a brass hoop, an old messenger ring, once used for falcons, now repurposed for whatever creature might come next. A servant offers to light a signal torch. You decline. Let the dragon figure it out. After all, he got it wrong the first time. As you return inside, someone has left you a message of your own. Scribbled hastily on the back of a wine invoice, it reads, "If you receive this, I'm sorry. It was meant for the other Lord W." Underneath in different ink, unless you're nicer. In which case, hello, you chuckle. Because sometimes history isn't made by wars or treaties. Sometimes it's made by a flying reptile with a bad sense of direction. The Black Dragon of Bruges. You're standing in the shadow of a bell tower, the kind that leans just slightly to the left, as if burdened by centuries of secrets and too many pigeons. Below, the cobbled streets of Bruges curve like a question mark, and above, perched on a spire blackened by time or possibly soot, is the silhouette of a dragon. Not a statue, not a gargoyle, just a suggestion. The locals call it De Zwarte Draak, the Black Dragon, and tonight's story uncoils like smoke in a wine cellar, part folklore, part threat, an entirely medieval melodrama. Tonight's historical fact: the city of Bruges, like many prosperous medieval hubs, was home to both vibrant trade and vibrant imagination. While dragons didn't technically fly over its rooftops, they certainly lived there in story. And one tale in particular circulated among merchants, monks, and overly dramatic candle makers spoke of a dragon who once served as a royal courier, until betrayal turned it postal. The legend begins with a black-scaled dragon who loyally delivered scrolls between noble houses. Fast, precise, stylish. A gold seal tied to each claw. He became a symbol of trustworthy correspondence, a flaming express pigeon, if you will. But then came the mistake, or the lie, or the betrayal. depending on which version you hear. One house, seeking power, forged a message, a false letter meant to incite war. They tied it to the dragon's claw and sent him off into the night wings, slicing through the mists above Flanders. When the dragon returned and realized what he'd been made part of, he was, according to the tale, furious. The sky over Bruges turned dark. The canals boiled slightly. Bread went unsold for a week, and the dragon vanished, but not before incinerating the weather vane of the betrayer's manor. Tonight's curious detail. For years afterward, merchants in Bruges referred to confusing or late letters as being marked by the black wing. Some even refused to use dark ink for correspondence, fearing it might attract the wrong courier. You're led now into a side chapel in a crumbling abbey where a faded mural depicts the black dragon tail curled around the tower scroll, dangling from its mouth like a forgotten promise. Beside it, a monk stands, with arms raised not in fear, but in apology. Some scholars think the story was a warning: don't misuse your messengers, even imaginary ones. Others say it was a way for the city to explain sudden disasters, missing shipments, or love letters gone aggressively sideways. And then there are the dreamers. They say the black dragon still circles Bruges on foggy nights, that if you see a streak of shadow cross the moon, it means a message is being returned, undelivered, unread, and a little bit scorched around the edges. You pass through the city square, now past a statue of a robed scribe holding a quill in one hand and a tiny dragon figurine in the other. A plaque beneath reads, "He wrote the truth. The dragon delivered it. The rest burned." This brings us to tonight's soft academic musing. Was the black dragon simply a tale of consequences wrapped in scales? Or did he represent a deeper fear that words once sent can never be called back, especially if they fly? You return to your room in a nearby inn where the beams creak and the curtains flutter like gossip. A letter waits on the table. No seal, no signature. Just 3 words in dark ink: "I still deliver." You blow out the candle. Outside, somewhere between the roofs and the clouds, a shadow flits silently across the sky. And whether it's wind owl or something older, you decide to let the message speak for itself. Because not all dragons guard treasure. Some guard the truth, and some remember. Taming with treats and Latin commands. You're in a courtyard that smells faintly of roasted chestnuts, overcooked cabbage, and the unmistakable scent of desperation disguised as training. A chalk circle marks the center of the space. Around it, scorch marks a stack of partially melted pewter bowls and what appears to be a large scroll labeled "Dragon Handling for Moderately Brave Nobles Volume 2. Curiostas. Tonight, we wade into the bizarrely well-documented and deliciously theatrical idea that dragons, those fire-breathing symbols of chaos, could be trained. Not with chains, not with threats, but with snacks. And Latin, yes. According to scattered manuscripts, whispers of folklore, and at least one overly confident friar dragons could be domesticated, provided you had the right treat and a solid grasp of grammar. Tonight's historical fact: medieval bestiaries often treated mythical creatures with the same tone they used for real animals. There were rules for unicorns, habits of manticores, and yes, taming techniques for dragons. Several texts include instructions for earning the loyalty of the winged flame, often involving food posture and very specific incantations in Latin. You hold up a hand-painted guide. It includes diagrams. Step 1. Present offering at arm's length. Do not make eye contact. Step 2. Speak the welcoming phrase. Venite, amis, caudatus. Come, tailed friend. Step 3. Wait for acknowledgement, usually a puff of smoke or a skeptical snort. Step 4. Place treat on clean stone. Back away. Repeat daily. Avoid Thursdays. Thursdays again. Dragons apparently had opinions about weekdays. The treats. They varied wildly. Some guides recommend honeyed goat liver. Others suggest spiced apples soaked in vinegar. One outlier written in the margins of a monk's gardening journal insists dragons prefer stale oatcakes drizzled in mead. The monk adds, "Don't ask how I know." You now find yourself beside a stone feeding trough carved with runes. Above it, a Latin phrase is etched, fidelitas per gustum, loyalty through taste. You dip a cloth into a bucket nearby. It smells of cloves and ash, possibly a medieval attempt at dragon seasoning. The note beside it reads, "For ceremonial purposes, not for soup, tonight's delightful oddity." A scroll discovered in the ruins of a Welsh manor includes a training song for dragons written in rhymed Latin couplets. It begins innocently, "Come forth, O scaled wonder, take this lamb and do not plunder," and ends several stanzas later with, "Unless I err, in which case, flea for flame shall chase both friend and tree." It's unclear whether it was ever sung, but someone clearly had rehearsal ambitions. Some scholars argue these rituals were never meant to work, only to impress. A nobleman instructing his servants to lay out dragon treats and recite phrases would look powerful, mysterious, and extremely committed to the bit. Dragons, real or not, became a form of performance. Domestication wasn't about control, it was about theater. This leads to tonight's soft scholarly puzzle. Did these taming traditions reflect a sincere belief in magical possibility? Or were they early forms of pageantry, ways to weave awe and obedience into the act of governance? Because if you can command a dragon with pastry and passive voice, surely you can command your barons too. The sun dips low now, casting long shadows across the practice yard. A group of apprentices kneel beside a practice effigy, shaped vaguely like a dragon, possibly just a roasted boar with wings. They whisper, "Bene dormias Draco." Sleep well, dragon. You nod respectfully. Everyone has to start somewhere. As you retreat to your chamber, you pass a tapestry. It shows a young noble offering a cake to a giant dragon, who leans down, eyes half closed, and gently takes it as if judging the flavor. Above them, embroidered in golden thread, power through patience. Patience through pastries. You close the door behind you. On the table, a single oat cake slightly singed with a ribbon around it. A note attached reads, "Well trained, aren't you?" You smile, because maybe dragons can't be tamed, but you can always try, especially if you speak their language and bring snacks. Sky ink and heat-proof parchment. You're seated at a desk that looks like it's been singed, chewed, mended, and then politely ignored for 2 centuries. Around you, scroll fragments, scraps of brittle vellum, and tiny ceramic pots of ink, most labeled with words like "volatile unwise" or "ask Brother Thomas first." One bottle is warm to the touch. That one is probably important. Tonight you've wandered into the quiet, crackling corner of history, where parchment met pyromania, the strange medieval quest to write letters durable enough to survive dragon delivery. Because if a creature breathes fire and flies at altitudes known to mess with goats, you can't just use your average sheepskin and ink pot. No, you need something tougher, smarter, slightly alchemical. Tonight's historical fact: medieval scribes experimented constantly with materials. While traditional ink recipes used oak, gall iron salts, and wine, yes, really more adventurous scribes, especially in monastic or courtly contexts, began mixing inks with ingredients meant to resist heat smudge less, or let's be honest, just look cooler. Add a dragon to the equation, and suddenly your correspondence needs to handle turbulence talons and the occasional sneeze of flame. You lift a scroll labeled "For Sky Transit Use Only." The edges are reinforced with thin bronze wire sewn into the vellum like tiny veins. It's heavy, slightly curled, smells faintly of vinegar and ambition. You unroll it and discover the ink is an iridescent green-black glimmering when it catches the candlelight. A note in the margin reads, "Tested at moderate altitude. Minor flame damage acceptable." You nod. Reasonable expectations. Tonight's delightfully odd detail. A 14th century Parisian apothecary claimed to have developed an ink that resisted heat and sang. Yes, sang. When warmed, it allegedly emitted a faint hum, like a lute string being plucked underwater. His notes were later banned by a bishop for being distracting during evening prayers. No further explanation was given. Back in the scriptorium, you examine several ink recipes, in costum candidum, made with powdered pearl and vinegar, meant to shimmer in low light and deflect heat. Ferrum vespertilio, batwing-infused ink supposedly smoke-resistant and mildly cursed. Ignis gratis, fire-kissed ink that allegedly grew darker with exposure to warmth, perfect for messages meant to be revealed mid-flight. Not to be outdone, some parchments were treated as well. Recipes include soaking sheets in brine, pressing them between warm slate, or coating them with a thin layer of honeyed resin. One scroll was found inside a stone urn, preserved perfectly, with a message that simply read, "Told you this would work." And yes, someone tried writing on metal. Thin sheets of lead or bronze rolled like parchment and bound with leather, unwieldy, heavy, and prone to smudging, but undeniably flame-proof. This leads us to tonight's cozy scholarly debate. Were these fireproof materials ever truly tested in dangerous conditions? Or were they symbolic gestures, medieval versions of packaging that said, "Fragile, but we tried our best"? It's easy to romanticize the past, but it's worth noting that most real couriers weren't dragons. They were overworked peasants with good legs and bad maps. Still, the myth of sky-carried messages demanded that someone somewhere ask, what if the letter burns before it lands? And so here you are, trying to decipher a scroll that survived who knows how many fires drops and moody dragons. You sit back, ink-stained fingers resting on a square of something suspiciously warm. A small side note reads, "If this document glows, do not lick it. That's for safety, not because it's been tried before." You sigh. Of course, it's been tried before. Outside, the wind shifts. Clouds curl around the moon, like parchment around a message. And for a moment, you think you see something moving, a shape crossing between starlight and smoke wings, stretched wide, heading somewhere important. Inside, you carefully cap the ink bottle, roll the fire-treated scroll, and tie it with a copper thread ribbon. Even if dragons never really flew through the skies with sealed letters in their claws, someone wrote like they might, and that's a kind of magic all its own. Monasteries that claimed dragon visits. You're walking through a cloister garden where the herbs grow in perfectly uneven rows. The air smells like rosemary damp wool and incense that's been burning since Tuesday, and a rooster is judging you from the roof of the scriptorium. Everything is quiet, almost suspiciously so, but then you spot it. On the wall of the refectory, tucked between faded frescoes of saints and fish, a painting of a dragon, not burning anyone, not being slayed, just delivering a scroll to a very calm-looking monk. Tonight's tale brings us to the hushed and echoing stone halls of medieval monasteries, some of which claimed either with sincerity satire or something in between that they had received visits from dragons, not as omens, not as plagues, but as messengers. Yes, that's right. Imagine your brother Ambrose tending your cabbages when a winged beast descends from the heavens, snorts once, and drops a scroll at your sandals before vanishing into the clouds with all the drama of a royal decree and the timing of a goose with purpose. Tonight's historical fact: while there is sadly no physical record of actual dragon landings at religious institutions, several monastic chronicles, especially those tucked in marginalia, describe celestial beasts or fiery couriers arriving to deliver news commands or even spiritual test results. Most scholars today interpret these as metaphors, visions, or the result of eating questionable cheese, but they were recorded with ink by people who took everything seriously. One such account comes from the Abbey of St. Leodore in 1323. The scribe writes with charming detachment, "At matins, as the mist lifted from the western field, a great beast cloaked in shadow and shaped of cloud and coal descended upon the orchard and laid before us a scroll. The message within bore no seal, but smelled of ash and honey." Ash and honey, very niche postal service. You wander through the Abbey library, now fingers grazing shelf after shelf of musty vellum. A novice monk brings you a document wrapped in oilcloth. It's cracked, faintly singed, and bears a note copy of message, allegedly brought by dragon. Do not store near fire sunlight or Brother Felix's cooking. The message itself, a list of names and dates, possibly a prophecy, possibly an inventory of wine barrels. Interpretations vary. Tonight's curious detail: in a monastery near the Alps, monks claim to have trained a small dragon or very large lizard to carry written prayers into the mountains. They released it during feast days, and if it didn't return, they assumed the prayer had been received. One drawing shows the creature with tiny saddlebags and what appears to be a halo. A fellow monk later added, may have been a goose, but a very intense one. Dragons weren't always taken literally. In many cases, they represented divine will, especially when they acted not as threats, but as messengers. A flaming winged beast that delivers instead of destroys, that's theological poetry. Or ecclesiastical fan fiction. And here comes tonight's contemplative debate. Did these monks really believe dragons brought them messages? Or were they using dragons as symbols of heavenly intervention, of mysterious knowledge, or of their own longing for importance in a very noisy world? Because let's be honest, if your monastery is out in the hills, weeks from the nearest town, and the highlight of your month is a new turnip variety, you might just write a story about a dragon courier landing during morning prayers. And maybe, just maybe, you'd believe it enough to paint it on a wall. You step into the scriptorium now, where a sleepy monk is repairing a torn scroll with goat glue and humming a tune suspiciously titled, "O Come Ye Flames of Understanding." You glance at his side table. There's a small carving of a dragon wing's folded scroll in mouth. He notices your stare and shrugs. He comes sometimes, the monk says. You raise an eyebrow. In dreams, he clarifies. You nod. Because honestly, at this point, what else is there to say? As you settle into a corner chamber for the night, you notice that even the iron hinges on the door are shaped like tiny dragons. Outside, the wind picks up, rustling the lavender and turning the weathered wind vane with a creaky little growl. And just as you close your eyes, you hear the soft flutter of something passing above the chapel roof. It might be wind. It might be bats. It might be a dragon checking for new messages. And somewhere in some dusty archive of the soul, a monk is already writing it down. The failed attempt to tax winged couriers. You're seated in the stone chamber of what was once a very serious man's very serious office. There are ledgers stacked like bricks and ink pot that has dried into a small topiary of tax anxiety, and a sign above the door that reads, "Nothing escapes the tithe, not even air." Beneath it, someone has scratched, except dragons apparently. Tonight we turn our gaze to a brief but unforgettable footnote in the history of medieval paperwork, the failed attempt to impose taxes on dragon-based delivery services. Yes, the very real bureaucratic dream of taxing imaginary airborne couriers. Tonight's historical fact: medieval tax systems were exhaustive. If it could move, be grown, or make noise, someone wanted to tax it. From chimney smoke to bee colonies, to the wearing of shoes on feast days, nothing was too small to warrant a tithe. So when tales of dragon messengers started flapping their way into courtly culture, it didn't take long for some overzealous officials to ask, should these be registered? One particularly bold steward from the region of Lion name, recorded as Marius the Thorough, drafted a proposal to classify aerial conveyances of magical or monstrous nature as taxable agents of delivery. His document cited winged commerce as an emerging disruption to the mule and messenger economy. His recommendation: 1 silver groat per league flown, additional fees for parchment weight fireproofing costs, and potential emotional distress caused by sudden descent. You glance at a faded copy of this proposed regulation. The top margin reads, "In the interest of fair skies and fiscal honesty." The bottom reads, "Draft not approved." Also, stop bringing this up, Marius. What killed the plan? Aside from the obvious lack of dragons, resistance from nobles, clergy, and common sense. You see, dragons, whether real or not, were woven into folklore as beings of power, freedom, and mystical purpose. Taxing one was like trying to charge a thunderstorm for dampening your laundry. Symbolically unwise, politically suicidal, and also deeply unpopular with the public. One record from a small Flemish town describes a riot that broke out when a scribe suggested logging dragon sightings as taxable events. Bakers threw buns. A goose was set loose. The scribe was relocated to cloud accounting, a post that involved watching the sky and filing very few reports. Tonight's delightfully ridiculous detail. A scroll from a mountain abbey lists unregistered sky couriers as a category in their tithe table. It includes falcons, unusually large bats, dragons. The bishop's pet heron crossed out. A side note reads, "If payment cannot be obtained, we recommend prayer and ducking." This brings us to tonight's scholarly pondering. Was the attempt to tax dragon couriers a sincere fiscal effort, or was it satirical, a monkish joke taken too seriously, or a bit of bureaucratic theater to flex a clerk's quill? Whatever the answer, the result was clear. Dragons remained gloriously untaxed. Even imaginary ones flew above the system, dodging toll booths with flair, and leaving scrolls, scorched footprints, and befuddled auditors in their wake. Outside the chamber window, The moon hangs low. You can hear a clerk sighing as he tries to calculate hypothetical air mileage from one keep to another. It sounds like the world's most exhausted lullaby. Back at your writing desk, you find a note slipped under your ledger. It's unsigned. The parchment is crisp. The ink is warm. It reads, "Nice try. We deliver, not declare. Regards the skies." You blow out your candle, because even in an empire of taxes, rules, and stamped permissions, there are some things that remain gloriously exempt. And dragons, of course, file no paperwork. Dragon delivery in medieval theater. You're sitting on a wooden bench that's been polished smooth by centuries of fidgeting. Around you, the air smells of sweat-spilled ale, and the particular anticipation that only comes when someone shouts, "Bring forth the scroll beast from behind a curtain made of bedsheets." Yes, you've entered the world of medieval theater, where props were optimistic, audiences were vocal, and dragons regularly delivered monologues and messages. Tonight's story steps out from the shadows of the stage into the blindingly candlelit world of dragon delivery as performance art. Tonight's historical fact. While dragons were already common in medieval storytelling, they truly roared to life on stage, especially in mystery plays, morality tales, and civic pageants. These events, part festival, part sermon, part chaos, often included elaborate dragon puppets that didn't just menace villagers or saints. They delivered scrolls, sometimes divine, sometimes royal, sometimes suspiciously poetic. You look toward the makeshift stage where a curtain jerks aside to reveal a dragon crafted from dyed canvas sticks and sheer ambition. Its jaw opens. A scroll drops with all the grace of a baked potato. The crowd cheers like it's seen a miracle, which honestly it has, in one surviving script from a 15th century French town, Le Livre des Signes Célestes. A dragon descends via pulley to deliver a warning from heaven. The stage directions are very specific. Roar thrice. Flutter wings if operational. Deliver scroll unto priest of doubt. Do not set fire to drapery again. A note from the director adds, "Remind Marcel not to scream during descent." Last year's panic was unhelpful. Tonight's delightful oddity. Some productions had cast the dragon not as a monster, but as a trusted courier of fate. In a morality play from Norwich, the dragon flies in red, is wheeled dramatically across stage bearing a scroll titled "The Truth Yet Untold." It unrolls it with a tail, a broomstick, and recites a prophecy in rhyming verse. The crowd gasps. A boy faints. Someone throws a turnip. The message, "Do good or else," very direct. You visit the back of the stage now, where props lie piled like retired warriors. A scroll basket labeled "Do Not Crumple." Sacred edicts sits beside a box of dragon tails, some soot-stained one still vaguely on fire. A script is pinned to the wall. In the margin, dragon enters stage left, but only if Bernard has finished cider. Medieval theater wasn't subtle, but it was sincere. Dragons delivering scrolls became shorthand for urgency, divine message, or theatrical budget flexibility. After all, if a fire-breathing beast shows up with a letter, people will listen, even if it's just the town's updated fish market hours. And here's your scholarly nightcap. Did these performances reflect genuine belief in dragon couriers? Or were they a theatrical way of showing that certain messages, be they warnings, truths, or invitations to repentance, deserve to arrive on wings? Probably both, because what's more memorable, a monk reading from a lectern or a 30-foot paper dragon spewing Latin and glitter while dramatically unfurling the truth? You settle back as the final act begins. The dragon returns, slightly deflated but noble. This time, it delivers a pardon from the king. The condemned man weeps. The dragon bows. The crowd erupts. Someone next to you whispers, "I don't know if it's real, but I believe it anyway." And maybe that's what matters, because sometimes messages are remembered because of the messenger. And a scroll delivered by a dragon, no matter how wobbly, is a message you don't forget. The candles gutter low. The actors bow. The dragon's head falls off. The audience applauds anyway, because even in a world where dragons only exist on strings, their messages still take flight. The rise of raven competition. You're crouched in a tower aviary that smells like feathers, old parchment, and secrets that prefer to arrive in triplicate. A raven stares at you with the quiet judgment of someone who's seen too many poorly folded scrolls. Around you perches quills and the faint rustle of winged professionalism. It's clear now you've entered the age of raven mail, and dragons unfortunately have competition. Tonight's historical fact. While dragons ruled the imagination, ravens ruled the sky. Actual medieval message delivery, especially over long distances, relied on birds far more plausible and far less flammable. Ravens, with their intelligence, trainability, and unshakable work ethic for a bird, became the real-life couriers of choice for noble houses, military operations, and monasteries with good upper windows. Which brings us to the not-so-fictional phenomenon of raven supremacy in the courier industry. The dragons may have had the flair, but the ravens had results. You glance at a training ledger on a stand. It includes notes like, "Corvinus delivered to Lord Bertram in under 3 hours. No casualties. Scroll intact, though, mildly pecked." Efficiency. In fact, as dragon myths grew more theatrical, ravens became the sober alternative. Where dragons arrived with fire and fanfare, ravens dropped and unbothered all business. A raven wouldn't demand a liver cake or burst into flames mid-delivery. It would just land, blink, and get paid in grain. You respect that. Tonight's curious detail. Some noble courts reportedly compared their bird teams the way modern people compare horses or wine cellars. A particularly bold count from Gascony once hosted a messenger duel where his raven faced off against a rival's trained falcon. The falcon got distracted. The raven delivered 2 messages and stole the opponent's ring. You like the raven already. By the 14th century, elaborate systems emerged in castles and city watchtowers, complete with raven lofts, feeding platforms, and color-coded scroll tubes. Some birds were even trained to circle once before landing, signaling that a message had arrived, a kind of avian doorbell. You walk past a row of perches now. Each has a small nameplate. Julius Mabel, Lord Inkface, not a crow. One scroll tube reads, "To be delivered at dawn, weather permitting. Do not shout at bird." You smile. It's professional courtesy. Of course not. Everyone gave up on dragons entirely. Some scrolls from this period include little flourishes, burned corners wax in the shape of scales, as if trying to keep the dream alive. One message even arrived via raven with a note attached. "Pretend this came by dragon. He's on leave." This brings us to tonight's gentle academic conundrum. Was the rise of raven couriers the end of dragon messaging myths, or their evolution? Did the raven become the acceptable face of a fantasy people still longed for, just with fewer combustion risks? One historian argues that the raven's quiet efficiency elevated the message itself, removing theatrics and centering trust. Another counters that dragons were simply outsourced to stage plays, embroidery, and bedtime tales. safer departments. Either way, the symbolism changed. The dragon meant grandeur. The raven meant get it done. And in a world where timely information could mean war or peace, feathers sometimes beat fire. As the evening deepens, you watch one last raven return. It lands lightly on a perch, drops a scroll into a waiting hand, and accepts a raisin with imperial dignity. The scroll reads, "Reply unnecessary. The message has arrived." You nod, because even if dragons owned the myth, it was ravens that delivered the reality. No smoke, no roar, just precision. And sometimes, the most powerful messages arrive not on wings of fire, but on wings of quiet feathered certainty. Scholars who debated dragon range, you're seated in a candlelit hall that smells like dried ink, philosophical dread, and an argument that's been going on since Tuesday morning. Around a long oaken table, a group of scholars is mid-dispute, one waving a compass, another holding a chicken feather, symbolic you hope, and a third aggressively pointing at a map of the Pyrenees. The topic, how far can a dragon fly without resting? Yes. Welcome to the most medieval academic debate you've never heard of the question of dragon range. Tonight's historical fact. While actual medieval scholars were famously good at arguing about theology, geography, and why fish don't count as meat, they were also not above hypothesizing about fantastical logistics. In manuscripts dealing with natural philosophy allegory. And let's be honest, daydreams disguised as fieldwork. Some minds tackled the question, if dragons were real, how far could they reasonably fly before getting tired, hangry, or both? One treatise from the University of Prague circa 1372 boldly proposed that a mature dragon could fly from the shores of Gaul to the sands of Judea in 3 days, provided favorable winds and no distraction from maidens. You cough discreetly. Another manuscript, this one penned by a monk with too much free time and a suspicious number of empty wine jugs, offered a calculation involving wingspan scroll weight and emotional willingness. He concluded that the ideal range was about 270 leagues, assuming the dragon was in a good mood. Tonight's curious detail. A well-respected scholar named Brother Arnaldus of Bremen published a table of estimated dragonflight distances based on region. His categories included swamp-born dragons, slow, easily bored, often wander off mid-task. Mountain dragons, efficient but territorial range up to 400 leagues if not insulted. Royal trained dragons, unconfirmed but rumored to ignore geography and time. He was later reprimanded for classifying them with the same system used for oxen. You're handed a scroll filled with sketches, dragons, midair, dragons holding tiny messenger bags, dragons wearing what appears to be snowshoes. One marginal note reads, must account for elevation-induced sulking. At the center of all this, a heated debate over whether dragons preferred direct routes over settlements or scenic detours over lakes and forests. One scholar insists they followed trade routes. Another claims they navigate by the stars and their sense of narrative momentum, which, honestly, checks out. And so tonight's academic puzzle for the pillow. Did these debates reflect sincere scientific curiosity, or were they elaborate metaphors for human doubt reach and the limits of knowledge? Because really, whether the dragon could fly 10 miles or 1,000 lure, the act of wondering maps something far more human than reptilian. Our obsession with speed accuracy and the noble dream that messages might travel faster than consequences. You step outside as the scholars continue debating. One has resorted to finger puppets. Another demands a flight trial using a pig and a kite. You quietly excuse yourself. The night is cool. A breeze rolls over the hills. Somewhere, an owl hoots, and you can't help imagining a dragon overhead. Wings slicing the sky eyes, scanning the valleys, scroll clutched carefully in claw. Not because it's plausible, but because someone somewhere took the time to calculate wind resistance. Back in your chamber, a note rests by your bedside. The ink is smudged. The seal is warm. The message: distance matters less than delivery, especially when it arrives on time. And with that, you drift off your dreams, lifting on wings of curiosity and soft, improbable logic. Because even in the quietest corners of dusty libraries, some questions still fly. The Last Letter by Flame. You're standing in a narrow tower room at dawn, where the stone is cold, the windows are fogged, and the air tastes faintly of ash and old ink. A single scroll lies on a wooden pedestal, in the center wrapped in scorched silk, sealed with a dragon's claw mark, pressed deep into dark wax. The edges of the scroll are curled and brittle, as if it had passed through fire. Or something worse. They say this was the last letter ever delivered by dragon. Tonight's final tale is wrapped in soot and legend, and whether it truly happened doesn't matter nearly as much as the fact that it's still remembered. The story begins with a scribe named Odalric Yes, a name that sounds like he came pre-equipped with melancholy. He lived in a time when dragon couriers were no longer fashionable. Raven posts had taken over. Nobles preferred predictable scrolls over theatrical flame. The sky once alive with wings and shadow was now the domain of clouds and birds with day jobs. But Odalric refused to adapt. He believed in dragons, not just as beasts, but as bearers of meaning, of truth, of messages too heavy for lesser creatures. He claimed to no one. A great aging dragon named Branir of the Embers, who made deliveries not for payment, but for honor. According to Odalric, Branir had not flown in years. He was old, reclusive, waiting for something worth his final flight. And then one night, a message arrived. A real one. A letter so important, so vital, that Odalric swore only Branir could carry it. He wouldn't say what it was. Some guessed it was a peace treaty. Others claimed it was a confession. One monk insists it was a love letter written 30 years too late. What's agreed upon is this: Odalric sealed it in silk, pressed the wax, and walked into the woods at dusk. A few villagers saw him raise his arm. And then, wings. Real or imagined, they swear something massive lifted into the air, trailing smoke. The next morning, this scroll, the one before you now, was found on the steps of a ruined chapel, 2 kingdoms away. Still warm, no signature, no address. Just a single line on the outer band, carried with flame, delivered with memory. Tonight's historical fact. This letter, whatever its origin, is real. Preserved in a monastery near Alsace. Studied by generations, it's known as the Scroll of the Last Flame. Scholars date the parchment to the 15th century. The ink has been tested, the seal examined. The edges truly are burned, but not by candle torch or furnace. The pattern is irregular, inexplicable, gentle. Tonight's peculiar detail. The scroll smells faintly and eternally of cinnamon. No one knows why. You now lean close to the pedestal. The light from the window glints off the wax. You don't dare touch it. It feels like one of those things you're meant to witness, not solve. And so here we arrive at your final bedtime debate. Was this last letter by dragon a real delivery, A romantic fabrication? A poetic act of someone who believed that messages like memories deserved a grand send-off? Or was it a quiet declaration that even as magic faded from daily life, it could still find its way into one last message? Outside, the sun has risen. The rooftops below are waking. No smoke, no wings, just the soft rising hum of morning. You descend the tower stairs, slowly, each step quieter than the last. By the time your foot touches the floor of the main hall, it feels like the scroll above may have never existed at all. But as you pass the door, you notice something on the lintel, a small mark burned into the wood. A claw, or perhaps just a crack. It doesn't matter. You smile, because every message eventually reaches its destination, even the ones that ride on smoke memory and soft wings of myth. And if this really was the last letter by dragon, it was right on time. And now, dear friend, the scroll has been delivered. The tower is quiet. The fire has faded to glowing embers. Outside your window, the sky stretches pale and gentle, as if even the clouds have set down their wings for a moment's rest. You've walked through castles and courtyards past feathered messengers and flame-born myths. You've watched nobles trust dragons over cousins, monks bless sky shadows, and scribes debate flight range like it mattered more than sleep. And maybe it did, because that's what history is. Sometimes not records carved in stone, but whispered beliefs wrapped in smoke and hope. A letter sent with no guarantee. A scroll singed at the edges, but written anyway. A myth so persistent it outlives the silence. Tonight, you haven't just explored why dragons were imagined as delivery services. You've listened to the quiet need behind the myth, the longing for swift truth, for unstoppable messages, for winged certainty in a world full of mud mistrust and missed connections. And that's what makes it beautiful. Not that it's real, but that someone, many someones, believed it could be. So let the dragons rest now. Let the scrolls curl gently in their ribbons. Let the parchment cool. You've traveled far enough for one night. Go ahead, close your eyes. The message has been sent. The sky is quiet. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.